So, a company in Australia is now selling a computer that has living human brain cells inside it. Not as a metaphor, not a chip that copies how the brain works, actual neurons grown from human cells kept alive on a slab of silicon, wired up and learning in real time. It costs about $35,000, it fits on a desk, and one of the first things they taught it to do was to play Pong, and honestly, the first time I read about this I assumed it was hype. It's not. This is real, it's happening, and it's one of the most fascinating corners of science I have ever fallen down. Stick with me to the end because the questions this stuff raises about what counts as thinking, and maybe even what counts as alive, get genuinely wild. If you're into things that sound like science fiction but are quietly showing up in real labs, do me a favor and tap subscribe now so you don't miss where this goes. Alright? Let me show you what these machines actually are. The building block for all of this is something called a brain organoid. Picture a tiny cluster of neurons, roughly the size of a pea or smaller than that maybe, grown in a dish. Scientists take ordinary adult cells from skin or blood and reprogram them backwards into stem cells, then coax those stem cells into becoming brain cells. Left in the right nutrient soup, they do something remarkable all on their own. They organize, they wire themselves together, form connections, and start firing electrical signals with no blueprint from anybody. People call them mini brains, which is cute but a little misleading because they're not conscious and they don't think in any way you would recognize. They're more like a small living model of a very early brain tissue. Now here's where it gets clever. Neurons and silicon chips actually speak the same basic language, and that language is electricity. So if you grow neurons directly on top of a grid of electrodes, you can send them signals and read their responses. That closed loop where the chip talks to the cells and the cells talk back is the whole foundation of this field. You are no longer just simulating a brain on a computer, you are plugging into a real one, and researchers are already using these clusters for all kinds of things, from modeling diseases to testing whatever new drugs and toxins are safe, to controlling little robots and even running experiments up in space. Now, the moment this stopped being a lab curiosity and started making global headlines came in 2022. A Melbourne startup called Cortical Labs published a study in the journal Neurons showing that a dish of around 800,000 living neurons had learned to play Pong. Yes, the old arcade game. Paddle, ball, keep it in play. They call the system DishBrain. Here's how it worked. When the neurons moved the paddle to hit the ball, they got a nice predictable electrical signal. When they missed, they got a chaotic random stimulation instead, and the cells, without anyone programming them to do it, started organizing their activity to chase the predictable feedback and dodge the chaos. In under 5 minutes, they were playing. Not well, but still playing. My favorite little detail though, the human neurons rallied longer than mouse neurons did. The theory behind this is honestly beautiful. It leans on something called the free energy principle from neuroscientist Carl Friston, which basically says living neural systems hate surprise and are constantly trying to make their world more predictable. The Cortical Labs team wanted to know whether that signal drive could produce a learning on its own, and it looks like it can. I find that idea genuinely elegant. That intelligence might partly come down to a bunch of cells trying to calm their own uncertainty. Fast forward to 2025, and Cortical Labs turned that experiment into an actual product called the CL1. They unveiled it in Barcelona and built it as the world's first commercial code-deployable biological computer. It's a self-contained unit, sometimes described as a body in a box, packed with pumps, gas, and temperature control that keeps neurons alive for up to 6 months. You can literally write code and deploy it straight onto living cells. Each one runs for about $35,000, and for labs without the right setup, there is a cloud version that you can rent into. The company pitches the whole thing as a neurons as a service, hardware that is self-repairing, adaptable, and sips a tiny fraction of the energy a normal AI system burns through. Oh, and they have moved well past Pong. They have gotten neurons running Doom, and in a 2025 comparison, the company reported that these brain cells learn certain tasks faster and more efficiently than state-of-the-art machine learning algorithms. That last part is the one that makes me sit up straight because efficiency is exactly where our current AI is hitting a wall. Now, while Cortical Labs went commercial, other labs went deep onto the biology. The person you really need to know here is Alison Watry at the UC San Diego. His lab grows brain organoids by tens of thousands, and back in 2019, his team pulled off something that still gives me chills. After months in culture, their organoids started producing electrical patterns so complex that a machine learning model could not tell them apart from the brainwaves of premature babies. That has never been seen in a dish before. Watry himself said that if you had asked him 5 years earlier whether it was even possible, he would have said no. For him, this is deeply personal. A lot of his work targets autism and rare disorders like Rett syndrome and many others, and his team has grown organoids from the cells of toddlers with autism and found that they grew larger, hinting at a link between early brain overgrowth and how severe someone's symptoms turn out to be. That is exactly the kind of insight you simply cannot get from a mouse, because a mouse's brain is not built like ours. And then there's the part that sounds made up. He sends brain organoids to space. On the International Space Station, his organoids showed molecular signs of aging and neurodegradation far faster than identical ones back on Earth, which basically hands researchers a fast-forward button on diseases that normally take decades to unfold. And just this month, in August 2026, news broke that the space-based work helped push a potential Rett syndrome treatment, a repurposed HIV drug, into an actual clinical trial. Watry thinks that it might be the first drug for a neurological condition ever discovered through space research, and whatever you make of mini brains, that is a real child getting a real shot at a treatment. It is pretty hard to argue with that. Now, over at Johns Hopkins, a team led by Thomas Hartung gave this whole idea a name back in 2023, Organoid Intelligence. Their angle is a little different. They want to scale these things way up. The trouble with organoids right now is size. A typical one is smaller than a millimeter and holds fewer than 100,000 cells, because without a blood supply, the cells buried in the middle just starve. So the Hopkins group is building perfusion systems and artificial vasculature, basically tiny plumbing to feed larger and longer-lived organoids and eventually push towards something closer to mouse brain scale. In 2025, they reported a multi-region whole brain organoid containing roughly 6 to 7 million neurons and about 80% of the cell types you would find in a real developing brain. Their biggest motivation is drug testing, and the reason is genuinely brutal. For brain disorders, treatments that work in animal models go on to fail in humans the overwhelming majority of the time, somewhere about 95%. That is decades of effort and billions of dollars, largely wasted because a mouse brain just isn't a human brain. A model made from actual human neurons could change that math entirely, and funding, including from the NIH, is starting to shift towards these human-based alternatives. As someone who is tired of hearing that yet another promising Alzheimer's drug flopped in trials, this feels like a genuinely smart pivot to me. So, here is the elephant in the room. Are these things aware? The honest answer from the scientists is no, not by any standard that we currently have, because the organoids we are talking about are tiny, closer to insect brain scale, and they lack most of the structure that consciousness seems to require. They have no senses, no body, no memory of a self. Interestingly, because they're not animals, a lot of this research also sidesteps the strict rules that govern animal experiments, which is part of why it can move so fast, but I would be lying if I said there were no open questions. As these models get bigger and live longer, philosophers and neuroscientists are seriously debating where the line sits. At what point does a cluster of firing human neurons start to have something it is like to be? Nobody actually knows, and to their credit, companies like Cortical Labs say that they have built in guardrails and take this concern very seriously. And honestly, the thing I appreciate most about this field is that the biologists are the cautious ones. They are literally handling the raw material of the mind, and they are the first to say slow down and think this through. Compare that to a lot of the noise around Silicon AI, and it's genuinely refreshing. And here's my honest take. This is one of the most hopeful technologies I have looked at in years. Not because brain chips are about to replace your laptop, they're not, but because this is a real path towards understanding our own brains and beating diseases that have humiliated medicine for a century. Systems that are living, learning, self-repairing, and sipping a fraction of the power a data center burns. That is worth being excited about, and if you've made it this far, you clearly love this stuff as much as I do, so go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps the channel more than you would think, and also subscribe so you're here when the next chapter of this story drops, because trust me, it's coming fast. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.